They laughed because that's what people do when they can't imagine something for themselves. They thought she was joking when she said she wanted to fly the Apache. The room echoed with half-sincere chuckles, heads shaking, someone muttering that she should try for a desk job instead. To them, her request was naive, almost ridiculous. They had seen others like her walk in full of ambition and walk out full of excuses. But what they didn't understand was that defiance had already become her default state. She had been told no too many times to believe it meant anything permanent. Defiance isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like showing up again the next morning, standing in the same line, filling out the same forms, running the same drills while everyone else has already written you off. She knew that proving them wrong would take more than words. So she stopped arguing. She started building evidence. Every mile run, every flight sim logged, every test aced was a quiet rebellion. She didn't just want the Apache. She was training herself to become the kind of pilot who could handle it, because the only way to silence doubt is to outperform it. She wasn't born into a family that understood aviation. Her world had been small town, small opportunities, small expectations. Her first view of a helicopter wasn't from a cockpit but from the ground, craning her neck, watching the blades slice through the sky like defiance made mechanical. Something about it struck her deep. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a promise. The kind of promise that tells you there's something out there worth chasing even if no one around you sees it yet. When she joined the academy, she didn't carry the swagger most recruits had. She carried silence, the kind that makes people underestimate you. They saw her as a curiosity, a woman with a dream too big for her frame. They didn't see the long nights she spent memorizing every instrument panel by heart, or how she practiced breathing under pressure until her pulse became her metronome. They didn't see the 10 times she almost washed out, or the 11 times she came back anyway. Defiance isn't about shouting back at the world. It's about staying in the fight after the world's already stopped watching. The harder they tried to box her in, the more she learned to use those walls as leverage. Every rejection became fuel. Every condescending comment became a checkpoint. She learned to smile when they doubted her, not out of politeness, but because she knew something they didn't. That belief is built in private and proven in public. When she finally got close to her chance at the Apache, the pressure was different. This wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about belonging. The Apache wasn't just a machine, it was a gatekeeper. Pilots who flew it were known for precision, control, instinct, and nerve. There was no margin for error, no room for self-doubt. She had to carry herself like she was already part of that world, even when it still felt miles away. The day of her assessment, she kept hearing the echoes of those early laughs. They'd become part of her internal noise, a reminder of where she started. But as the rotors spun and the air grew heavy with motion, something shifted. Fear didn't disappear, but it stopped mattering. Defiance took its place. She wasn't fighting them anymore. She was fighting for mastery, for the truth of what she'd always known. That capability has no gender, and dreams don't need permission. Flying the Apache was never about proving she could do what men could. It was about proving that excellence doesn't have a face, a voice, or a stereotype. The machine didn't care who sat in the seat. It only cared about control, discipline, and trust. And in that moment, as she felt the helicopter respond to her touch, she understood that defiance had transformed into something else, command. Every barrier she'd faced had taught her how to maneuver under pressure, how to stay calm when chaos unfolded, how to trust herself even when others didn't. The laughter had been noise. She had become signal. She learned that doubt from others isn't the real enemy. It's the doubt that tries to grow inside you. The fight was never against them. It was always against the quiet voice that says maybe they're right. And so she kept flying, not to prove a point anymore, but because she'd earned the sky. Every mission, every flight hour, every sound of the blades was a reminder that defiance had been the first step, not the destination. The tattoo on her neck wasn't decoration. It wasn't there to look fierce or to start conversations. It was a symbol burned into memory before it was ever inked into skin. People noticed it, of course. They always do when something doesn't fit the neat picture they have of someone. They'd ask what it meant, expecting a story about rebellion or some vague statement about freedom. She never answered directly. She would just smile, that calm, unreadable smile that comes from knowing more than the question allows. The truth was, that small mark carried more history than most people could bear. It wasn't art, it was proof. The symbol was from her old unit, the one nobody outside of it ever really talked about. A handful of pilots who'd been through missions that didn't make it to the reports, who'd seen what most can't even imagine. To where it meant you'd flown through something that tried to end you. It meant you'd been trusted to hold the line when communication failed, when weather turned hostile, when fuel ran low and the maps stopped making sense. The mark wasn't given. It was earned, often quietly, often painfully. She'd gotten it after a mission that almost didn't end. The kind that leaves you with ringing in your ears and a silence that lasts for weeks. That was the night she learned what it meant to keep a machine alive by sheer will. The night when the sky turned red and her co-pilot's voice went static. The night when survival stopped being an instinct and became a decision. That decision was the reason she still had breath, and that breath became the reason she carried the tattoo. Not for pride, not for show, but as a contract between who she was and who she promised to remain. Years later, when she walked into that briefing room and asked to fly the Apache, no one knew the story behind the mark. To them, it was just an odd detail on a woman who didn't seem to belong in the same category as the hardened pilots who bragged about sorties and kills. They saw her as someone reaching too high. But when the air marshal's eyes caught that tattoo, something in his posture shifted. He recognized it instantly, the emblem of a unit that didn't waste its ink. That single glance rewrote her story in his mind. She was no longer the woman with a wild request. She was a survivor from a lineage of the few who'd earned their wings in fire. The symbol of experience isn't always visible. For her, it just happened to be etched where the world could see it. But most of what it stood for lived under the skin. The instinct to scan the horizon even when everything seems calm. The way her hands stayed steady no matter what the instrument panel screamed. The ability to measure danger not by fear, but by math and memory. She had been tested in ways that left no room for ego. The tattoo wasn't a trophy. It was a scar that had learned to tell its story in shorthand. It reminded her of people she'd flown with, people who never made it home. Each line of the design connected to a memory, a name, a sound, a smell. It was both her reminder and her responsibility. To carry it meant to carry them too. Every mission after that one was flown with a quiet promise that none of what they went through would be wasted. That's why when she spoke about wanting to fly again, it wasn't ambition speaking, it was unfinished business. In the military, symbols matter. They separate the ones who imagine from the ones who've done. They are shorthand for trust. You don't need to explain yourself when your history is inked into your skin in a language that only the initiated understand. That's why the laughter stopped so abruptly. The moment the air marshal saw it, he knew she wasn't a dreamer reaching above her station. She was one of them, one who had already proven her place in skies that didn't forgive mistakes. For her, carrying that symbol was also a reminder that experience isn't about age or rank. It's about what you've survived and what you've learned from it. Every pilot carries ghosts, but not all carry them with honor. The tattoo was her way of keeping the line between pride and humility sharp. It said, "I've been there, but I don't need to talk about it." It said, "I've earned this silence." It said, "I can fly because I've already fallen and stood back up." The mark was there every time she looked in the mirror before a flight. Not as a challenge, not as motivation, but as calibration. It aligned her focus. It reminded her that the machine she was about to command demanded everything she had: precision, respect, and truth. And when the blades spun and the roar filled the air, she could feel the same pulse that had carried her through that night long ago. It wasn't fear or adrenaline. It was the weight of experience, steady and unshakable, written in ink where the world could see, but only a few could truly understand. They said flying an Apache wasn't for her kind. They didn't always say it directly. Sometimes it was in the pauses between sentences, sometimes in the raised eyebrows, sometimes in the way they adjusted their tone when talking to her. The message was always the same. People like her didn't belong in that seat. The Apache was a symbol of dominance, of precision, of a kind of aggression the world had been trained to associate with men. She didn't argue. She just listened, memorized every word, and let it fuel her. Breaking stereotypes isn't a moment. It's a series of small, deliberate acts of defiance. It's showing up in places where no one expects you, wearing calm like armor, and letting your competence do the talking. Every time she walked into the hangar, she could feel the doubt hanging in the air. It wasn't hostility, it was habit, the kind that's been passed down through generations of unchallenged assumptions. She was stepping into a world built by men who'd never been questioned about their right to be there. That didn't intimidate her. It motivated her. She'd learned early that people's expectations are traps disguised as traditions. The world tells you what you can't do because it doesn't want to rewrite the rules when you prove you can. When she entered training, her instructors were polite but distant. They didn't know how to read her. Some assumed she was fragile. Others thought she was reckless, trying to prove something. What none of them saw was that she didn't want to prove anything except her own capability. She didn't want a separate standard. She wanted the same one, the hard one, the one that scared even the confident. During drills, she spoke less and listened more. She studied the way her peers moved, how they managed control, how they handled failure. She made her mistakes quietly, learned from them faster than anyone expected, and built a rhythm of progress that didn't fit their stereotypes. When others grew frustrated, she recalibrated. When they lost focus, she doubled down. She wasn't trying to outshine anyone. She was trying to build a record that couldn't be dismissed as luck or favoritism. The first time she flew solo, there was no applause waiting for her when she landed. There was silence, the kind that means people are rethinking what they thought they knew. That was enough. Because the truth about breaking stereotypes is that it rarely looks heroic in real time. It looks ordinary. It looks like doing the work no one expects you to survive doing. It looks like grace under pressure, professionalism mistaken for luck, excellence mistaken for exception. She noticed how people's language changed over time. At first, they called her determined. Then they called her lucky. Then they called her talented. But what they never called her was typical. That word stayed locked away, guarded by an old belief that refused to die. But she didn't need it. Being the exception meant she was proof of concept, living evidence that the stereotype was flawed. Every flight she completed was data against the myth. She also knew that representation alone wasn't enough. Breaking stereotypes isn't just about existing in the space. It's about normalizing the presence of those who come after you. She didn't want to be remembered as the one woman who did it. She wanted to make sure there was never a first or only again. So she mentored younger cadets quietly, answered questions no one else would, told them the truth about the work, that it was brutal, demanding, sometimes isolating, but possible. The Apache itself became part of her rebellion. It was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of strength, intimidation, and power. Yet there she was, commanding it with precision born not of ego, but of focus. Every maneuver, every correction, every mission was proof that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it operates in silence, under complete control. The machine didn't care that she didn't fit their stereotype. It only cared that she flew it right. And that, more than anything, exposed the flaw in their thinking. Over time, the laughter faded. The doubts softened into respect. The same people who once questioned her started to seek her judgment, her perspective, her calm under pressure. That's how stereotypes begin to crack, not through speeches or arguments, but through undeniable competence repeated until disbelief becomes embarrassment. She didn't need to demand equality. She created it by leaving no space for inequality to breathe. The irony was that the very traits they once dismissed, her precision, her patience, her intuition, became her greatest strengths in the cockpit. The qualities they labeled feminine turned out to be tactical advantages. Her ability to read a situation, to manage chaos without panic, to make fast, empathetic decisions under pressure, those weren't weaknesses. They were survival tools. And as the missions grew harder and the stakes grew higher, even her toughest critics started to see that maybe the stereotype had been holding them back too. In the end, she didn't just break the stereotype, She made it obsolete. Not by fighting it head-on, but by flying past it, so high and so steady that no one could look up without questioning what they'd been taught to believe. Respect was never something she asked for. It wasn't something she thought could be requested, negotiated, or gifted. From the beginning, she understood that in her world, respect came only one way, through results. When she walked into that hangar, she didn't look around for approval. She looked for standards. She wanted to know what excellence looked like so she could meet it, match it, and then quietly raise it without fanfare. The laughter, the side comments, the disbelief, none of it could touch her once she realized that words had no weight against performance. She knew the moment she started defending herself with explanations, she'd already lost. Explanations sound like apologies to people who've already made up their minds. So instead, she let silence do her talking. When others bragged, she trained. When they doubted, she delivered. When they tested her patience, she turned it into endurance. She treated respect like air, not something to demand, just something to earn by staying in the game long enough that people had no choice but to acknowledge you were still standing. The training field was where the first cracks appeared in their certainty. She didn't outmuscle anyone, but she outlasted most. While others burned out, she stayed consistent. While some lost focus after failure, she studied the failure until it became familiar enough not to scare her. Every challenge became an opportunity to build evidence. She wasn't chasing their approval. She was building her credibility one test at a time. Over weeks and months, the laughter began to fade into a quiet kind of observation. The kind that happens when people start to realize they've underestimated someone. When she first took the Apache controls, there were still those watching from the sidelines, expecting her to make the mistake that would prove them right. She could feel their eyes on her. But the thing about pressure is, it either breaks you or sharpens you. For her, it did the latter. The more they waited for her to fail, the more focused she became. The cockpit was where she belonged, not because she said so, but because the data backed it. Flight hours logged, missions completed, precision under stress, all of it measurable, all of it undeniable. Respect, she learned, has nothing to do with how loud you are. It's measured in consistency, in how you perform when no one is watching and how you react when everyone is. The pilots who once rolled their eyes when she spoke began to ask for her input. Not because she demanded it, but because she had proven, over and over again, that she understood what mattered: control, accuracy, calm. The same qualities they once dismissed as softness became the traits they started to rely on. There was a moment, not dramatic, not cinematic, when everything shifted. A mission went wrong, weather closed in, communication dropped out, and panic rippled through the team. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't panic. She simply did what she'd trained to do. When they landed safely hours later, no one said a word at first. They didn't need to. The respect was there, unspoken, heavier than applause. That was the moment she understood that leadership doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it reveals itself in crisis, in quiet competence that makes others steady just by being near it. She'd seen too many people mistake authority for respect. Authority can be assigned. Respect must be earned. It's not in the rank or the title. It's in the repetition of discipline, the way you show up every day and refuse to cut corners. She'd learned that respect isn't about being liked. It's about being trusted. And trust comes from reliability, the kind that doesn't need reminders, the kind that people lean on when everything else is unstable. Her silence became her language. When others tried to provoke her into defending her place, she just nodded, turned back to the work, and let the results speak. There's a certain kind of power in that, in refusing to participate in someone else's version of you. She didn't argue for space. She made space by being too competent to ignore. That's the thing about true respect. It can't be faked, it can't be forced, and once it's earned, even your critics start using your name as a reference for excellence. Over time, those who had doubted her stopped testing her because they realized her standards were higher than theirs. She became the benchmark without ever saying a word about it. The younger recruits began to watch her, not because she was loud, but because she was consistent. They noticed how she treated every task, big or small, with the same precision. They noticed how she never blamed, never boasted, just delivered. Respect followed her not because she chased it, but because she created an environment where it couldn't help but exist. Earning respect is a slow burn. It's not in the single victory, but in the accumulation of small ones. It's the weight of reliability, the track record of discipline, the quiet trail of proof that says, I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to do what I came to do. And eventually, that kind of proof becomes impossible to ignore. Courage didn't come to her in a sudden rush. It came in fragments, in the quiet decisions that stacked up over time. Every time she showed up when it would have been easier to quit, every time she chose to stay steady when doubt pressed in, that was courage. Not the cinematic kind that comes with music and speeches, but the real kind. The kind that grows from discomfort and persistence. She learned that courage wasn't about feeling fearless. It was about choosing to keep going while fear sat right beside her. Her identity had always been complicated. She didn't fit neatly into categories, and that made people uneasy. They wanted her to either soften or harden, to pick a version of herself that made sense to them. But she refused to shrink or overcorrect. She decided to exist exactly as she was, quiet but unshakable, precise but passionate, strong without needing to announce it. In a place where conformity was safety, she became an outlier by choice. That choice required courage every single day. She remembered the first time she walked into that room full of pilots. All confidence, all tradition, all eyes turning toward her. She could feel the skepticism before anyone said a word. Her instinct told her to blend in, to minimize her difference. But another instinct, stronger and older, told her not to. The moment she decided not to hide who she was became the moment everything began to shift. It was the kind of courage that doesn't draw attention. It just quietly refuses to disappear. People often mistake courage for defiance, but they're not the same. Defiance pushes against others. Courage steadies yourself. She learned that the hardest kind of bravery wasn't standing up to them. It was standing up to her own doubts. When the noise around her got loud, when the looks and whispers started to pile up, she fought the small, invisible battles inside her head. The ones that asked, do I really belong here? The ones that tempted her to make herself smaller just to fit in. She fought those questions every day, and every time she didn't give in, she grew stronger. Her tattoo, her scars, her silence, all of it was part of her identity. It wasn't something she performed, it was something she carried. People told her to be careful, to not make waves, to avoid drawing attention. But courage for her wasn't about rebellion. It was about honesty. It was about showing up fully, even when it made others uncomfortable. She realized that true strength isn't loud. It's measured in how much truth you can carry without breaking your balance. In flight training, courage took on a different meaning. It wasn't about charging into danger. It was about control. It was about trusting her instincts when everything in her body wanted to panic. It was about keeping her hands steady when alarms screamed in the cockpit, about focusing on the horizon when the world outside turned into chaos. Courage, she learned, was discipline under pressure. The more she faced uncertainty, the more she recognized it as familiar terrain. There were moments when her courage was tested in ways no one else could see. The nights when exhaustion crept in, when loneliness made her question if it was worth it, when every setback felt personal. She didn't have a cheering section. There was no one reminding her she was making history. She had to be her own witness. That's what made it real, the private courage that doesn't need an audience to count, the kind that builds resilience in silence. She wore her identity like a uniform and a shield at once. It was something that grounded her even when it made her stand out. In rooms full of people who looked and thought differently, she became the proof that difference wasn't weakness. It was perspective, her way of thinking, of processing, of approaching risk. All of it came from who she was. That was her advantage, not her liability. And when people finally began to see that, the same qualities that once isolated her became the very ones they relied on in critical moments. Courage and identity isn't about declaring who you are once. It's about defending it daily. It's about making peace with not being understood and finding strength in that solitude. She learned that authenticity and bravery are twins. One cannot exist without the other. Every time she chose to show up as herself, unfiltered and unapologetic, she was reinforcing that courage isn't an act. It's a lifestyle. Even when she reached the point where others respected her, she never forgot what it had cost to hold on to herself. She had to fight against the slow erosion of authenticity that comes with success, the temptation to blend in, to play safe, to stop standing out now that she'd been accepted. But courage isn't something you use once and retire. It's something you keep renewing, especially when the world starts clapping. Because it's easy to be brave when no one believes in you. It's harder when everyone does, and you still have to stay true to who you were before they noticed. Her courage was quiet, steady, invisible to most. It wasn't about proving she was unbreakable. It was about proving she didn't have to change her shape to fit into spaces that were never built for her. Every decision to stay authentic became an act of rebellion, and every act of rebellion became another way of saying she wasn't going to let fear edit her story. Legacy wasn't something she thought about at first. In the beginning, it was all about survival, passing tests, earning hours, proving she deserved to be there. She was too busy climbing to look down at the path she was carving. But over time, when the laughter had faded and the silence of respect had settled in, she began to notice the eyes watching her. The younger cadets who lingered in the hangar longer than they needed to. The ones who listened when she spoke even though she wasn't trying to teach. That was when she understood that what she was building was bigger than her own dream. Her flight wasn't just about flight anymore. It had become a message, a living example that the boundaries people talk about are often imaginary. The same way she once needed to see someone who looked like her in the pilot's seat, now others needed to see her. She realized that inspiration doesn't always come from speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from simple visibility, the act of existing where you're told you don't belong. For someone else, that can be enough to make the impossible start to look like an option. She had spent years being underestimated, judged, and dismissed. But those experiences had given her a kind of clarity most people never get. She knew exactly how it felt to be unseen, and that knowledge became her quiet mission. Every time she trained a recruit, every time she answered a question without condescension, every time she stayed patient when frustration flared, she was building a different culture, one that didn't rely on gatekeeping but on guidance. Her legacy wasn't in the records or the ranks. It was in the shift that happened in people's minds when they saw her fly. The idea that skill and strength could come in any form, that excellence wasn't owned by any one group, that dedication could rewrite tradition. She didn't speak about change, she embodied it. And that kind of legacy lasts longer than medals or citations because it doesn't depend on memory. It spreads through imitation. There was a day when a young pilot approached her after training. The girl couldn't have been more than 20, still carrying that raw mix of nerves and ambition. She told her she'd never seen someone like her flying before, that seeing her in the Apache made her believe she could do it too. That single moment told her everything she needed to know about why her fight had mattered. It wasn't just about proving she could. It was about opening the door wide enough for others to walk through without hesitation. She started to carry herself differently after that. Not heavier, not prouder, but with more purpose. Every flight became part of something continuous, a line connecting the ones before her and the ones after. Legacy, she realized, isn't something you leave behind when you're done. It's something you build while you're still in motion. It's how you use your space to make room for others. It's how you make sure that when people follow your path, they find fewer obstacles than you did. The air marshal once told her that leadership wasn't about control, it was about example. She understood that deeply now. Her story had begun with disbelief and laughter, but it evolved into something steadier, proof that persistence outlives prejudice. The same people who once dismissed her had started quoting her discipline, her methods, her focus. She'd gone from outsider to reference point. And that transformation wasn't luck, it was legacy in motion. She knew that someday someone else would come along and take her place, someone faster, younger, maybe braver. And she wanted that. Because true legacy doesn't cling to titles, it celebrates evolution. She wasn't afraid of being replaced. She was afraid of being the last. Her hope was that when the next pilot stepped up and said, "I want to fly the Apache," no one would laugh anymore. That's how she measured her success, not in applause, but in the silence that comes when doubt has no argument left. Her tattoo had once been a symbol of survival. Now, it had become a symbol of continuation, a reminder that what she'd endured wasn't just for her. Every scar, every setback, every hard-earned moment of respect, it all built a foundation that someone else could stand on. The mark on her neck wasn't just history, it was inheritance. It meant that the fire she flew through hadn't burned her out. It had cleared the way. She often thought about the early days, when all she wanted was a chance. She hadn't known then that the fight for that chance would ripple outward, changing things for people she'd never even meet. But that's how legacies work. Quietly, invisibly, through influence that stretches beyond sight. Her story wasn't meant to end with her. It was meant to keep flying, carried by others who'd seen what was possible and refused to settle for anything less.